So, picture this. It's the 4th century, and the North African church is being torn apart by this absolutely bitter conflict over betrayal, purity, and power. The fight goes on for decades, and the first person to really stand up and challenge it isn't some famous theologian from Rome. No, it was a pretty modest provincial bishop named Optatus. And this whole story, it raises a question that, honestly, we're still wrestling with today. Right at the heart of this entire firestorm was one single profound question. What is the true church? Is it a perfect, exclusive society of saints, totally walled off from the world, or is it a universal, unified body, one that's big enough to hold both saints and sinners? It's a tension you see everywhere, right? Even now, think about it. Movements, online communities. Does a group stay pure to its founding ideals, or does it try to unify a broader, more imperfect coalition? This was the battle line, and on either side were the Donatists and the Catholics. Now, to really get how this whole schism got started, we have to rewind the clock. We have to go back to a moment of just terrifying crisis for Christians all across the Roman Empire, the brutal persecution under the Emperor Diocletian. The emperor's command was simple and absolutely brutal. Hand over your holy books to be burned or face the consequences. For the church leaders, this was an impossible choice between their faith and their life, and a lot of them, they complied. So when the persecution finally lifted, the community was left with this deep, festering wound. The big question was, what do we do with the people who caved under pressure? Well, the community had a name for them: traditores. It literally means those who handed over. But this was so much more than a description. It was a brand of shame. It was a mark of deep personal betrayal that just poisoned relationships and set the stage for a full-blown schism. And that resentment against the traditores, it didn't just fade away. Oh no, it festered. And pretty soon, it was about to boil over into a formal, official break, all sparked by a council meeting where a really shocking secret came to light. Okay, get this. This quote reveals an absolutely incredible hypocrisy. In 305, a council of bishops gets together in Cirta to pick a new leader. They start out by demanding to know if everyone in the room is pure. But then, one by one, they all confess to being traditores themselves. As Optatus sarcastically points out, they just kind of forgave each other and moved on. And these were the very same men who would soon demand absolute, uncompromising purity from everybody else. Unbelievable. The final straw came 7 years later in the powerful city of Carthage. A man named Sicilian gets elected bishop. The problem? Well, the guy who consecrated him, Felix of Opthangi, was immediately accused by his opponents of being a traitor. For the faction that was demanding absolute purity, this was just unacceptable. An unclean bishop, they argued, could not possibly perform a valid consecration. The source was tainted. So the opposition takes a radical step. They gather their own council, declare Sicilian's election totally void, and they install their own guy, Maiorino, as the bishop of Carthage. And just like that, there were 2 rival bishops and 2 rival churches in the exact same city. The schism had officially begun. Now, what started as a local church dispute was about to escalate, and I mean dramatically. The dissenting faction, which would soon be known as the Donatists, decided to appeal to a higher power, the most powerful man in the world, the Emperor Constantine. And this is where we see just a glaring contradiction. It's laid out right here. The Donatists' public slogan was basically, "What does the emperor have to do with the church?" They publicly scorned any state interference. But behind the scenes, they were the very first ones to write to Constantine begging him to step in. It was a massive political gamble that was about to backfire spectacularly. You see, Constantine actually took the request seriously. He called a council in Rome. It ruled for Caecilian. The Donatists appealed. So he called a much bigger council in Arles. It also ruled for Caecilian. And then, as a final step, Constantine ordered a full secular investigation into the original accusation. And what do you know? Felix of Opthangi was found completely innocent. The Donatists had lost and lost and lost again. But, losing in court didn't mean they were ready to give up. The movement found a brilliant new leader, a guy named Parmenion, who shifted the battle. He moved it away from legal appeals and into full-on theological warfare. He laid out a powerful new vision for what the Donatist church should be. The title of Parmenion's major work says it all: Against the Church of the Traitors. Whoa, this wasn't just a friendly disagreement anymore. This was a holy war. In his view, the Catholic Church, by tolerating the traditores, had become corrupt, illegitimate, Only the Donatists, this pure remnant in Africa, were the one true church. So let's break this down, because this chart is really the heart of the conflict. For the Donatists, the church had to be an exclusive club for saints. A priest with any moral stain? Well, he invalidated every single sacrament he performed. It's like a modern ideological purity test, but with eternal salvation on the line. The Catholics, and this is where Optatus comes in, saw it completely differently. The church was a mixed body, like a field with both wheat and weeds, and it was up to God to sort them out at the end of time. The power came from Christ, not from the flawed human being administering the sacrament. And the true church wasn't some local group, it was universal, or, Catholic. And this is where our protagonist, Optatus of Milevis, finally steps onto the stage. He was the first Catholic bishop to systematically take apart the Donatist arguments, creating the intellectual foundation that would be used for the next 100 years. Okay, Optatus's first brilliant move was to separate the sacrament from the minister. It's a concept that later got this fancy Latin name, ex opere operato, from the work performed. The idea is actually pretty simple. Baptism is holy because of what Christ does, not because of the moral purity of the priest. The priest is just the instrument. The power belongs to God. This just completely undercut the Donatist claim that Catholic sacraments were invalid. Next, Optatus basically weaponized geography. He pointed out that the word Catholic means universal. He was essentially holding up a map and asking, how can you possibly claim to be the true church when you only exist in one small corner of Africa? The real church, he argued, was in communion with churches all over the known world, in Spain, in Gaul, in Italy, all the way to the east. The Donatists, they were a regional sect, not a global faith. And that brings us to his final, and maybe his most devastating argument, apostolicity. Optatus argued that the true church possesses the chair of St. Peter in Rome, passed down through an unbroken line of succession. He could literally list every bishop of Rome from Peter all the way down to the current pope, Siricius, who he was in communion with. The Donatists, well, they couldn't do that. So, with this powerful challenge, Optatus basically threw down the gauntlet. He's asking, where did you guys come from? Show me your credentials. Show me the receipts. He could trace his church's authority all the way back to the apostles. They could only trace theirs back to Maiorino, the rival bishop they set up just a few decades earlier. It was a killer blow to the very foundation of their legitimacy. But here's the tough part. Intellectual victories don't always translate into peace on the ground. While Optatus was busy winning the theological argument, the schism itself was descending into decades of real-world violence and social chaos. The Donatist cause was taken up by these bands of violent fanatics known as the Circoncilians. They were often poor, rural laborers, and they roamed the countryside, basically enforcing their brand of Christianity with clubs. They attacked Catholic clergy, extorted landowners, and saw themselves as holy warriors. To them, dying in a clash with Roman authorities wasn't a tragedy. It was a glorious martyrdom. The violence really hit a fever pitch in 362. The pagan emperor Julian the Apostate, hoping he could weaken Christianity by letting it fight with itself, allowed exiled Donatist bishops to return home. As Optatus describes it, they came back full of fury, unleashing a wave of terror, seizing churches, and attacking their Catholic neighbors. This wasn't a theological debate anymore. It was practically a civil war. So what was the final legacy of our provincial bishop? Well, Optatus didn't live to see the end of the schism, but his clear, powerful arguments on the nature of sacraments, the universality of the church, and apostolic succession, they became the essential playbook. They were picked up, refined, and wielded by the next generation's intellectual giant, St. Augustine, who would eventually win the theological war that Optatus had started. And that leaves us with the question the Donatists first posed, a question that echoes way beyond the 4th century. When do you draw the line? How does any group, whether it's religious, political, social, whatever, balance its demand for ideological purity with the messy reality of human weakness? It's that timeless tension between the ideal and the real, a fight for the soul of a community that continues in many forms, even today.